My husband Clark dumped me at the Riverside Homeless Shelter with nothing but 2 garbage bags of clothes, laughing as he drove away in our Mercedes with his secretary. He thought I'd come crawling back within days, begging him to take me home. What he didn't know was that I was standing in front of a building I'd been secretly funding for 3 years, and when I walked into Director Emily's office and revealed who I really was, the look of shock on her face was nothing compared to what Clark would experience when his perfect life came crashing down. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The rain pounded against the cracked sidewalk as I stood there, clutching 2 black garbage bags that contained everything Clark had decided I was worth after 12 years of marriage. The Riverside Community Shelter loomed before me, its weathered brick facade and peeling paint telling stories of countless people who had found themselves at rock bottom. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd driven past this building hundreds of times, never imagining I'd one day be standing on its doorstep as a resident rather than a benefactor. Clark's Mercedes disappeared around the corner, his laughter still echoing in my ears along with his parting words. Maybe a few nights sleeping. With the homeless, we'll teach you some gratitude, Claudia. Don't expect me to come rescue you. You made your choice. What he didn't realize was that he'd just delivered me to the one place in the city where I held more power than he could ever imagine. The automatic doors slid open with a soft whoosh, and the familiar smell of industrial cleaning supplies mixed with coffee hit me immediately. The lobby buzzed with quiet activity, social workers moving between offices, residents checking in for evening meals, volunteers setting up cots in the main dormitory. Everyone looked purposeful, dedicated, exactly as I'd hoped when I'd first started writing those anonymous checks 3 years ago. I approached the reception desk where a young volunteer with kind eyes looked up from her paperwork. "Hi there, I'm looking for emergency housing," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "My husband, he brought me here, said this was where I belonged now." The volunteer's expression immediately softened with practiced compassion. "Of course. Honey, let me get Emily. She's our director. She'll take good care of you." She picked up a phone and spoke quietly. "Emily? There's a new resident who needs intake. Yes, I'll send her right up." My heart began to race. Emily Patterson had been the shelter director for 5 years, transforming this place from a basic overnight facility into a comprehensive support center that provided job training, mental health services, and transitional housing. I'd read every quarterly report, every newsletter, every grant application. I knew her work better than she knew I existed. The elevator ride to the 2nd floor felt eternal. Through the window, I could see Clark's Mercedes parked across the street, engine running. He was waiting, probably expecting me to come running out within the hour, broken and apologetic. The thought made my jaw clench with determination. Emily's office door bore a simple nameplate and a hand-drawn rainbow from what was clearly a child's grateful hand. I knocked softly. "Come in," came a warm voice from inside. Emily Patterson was exactly as I'd imagined from the photos in the annual reports. Mid-40s, silver streaking through her brown hair, wearing a practical cardigan over dark jeans. Her office walls were covered with thank you letters, program certificates, and photos of former residents who'd successfully transitioned to independent living. She looked up from her computer with the same compassionate expression I'd seen her wear in every interview, every community meeting. "Hi there, I'm Emily. Please have a seat." She gestured to a comfortable chair across from her desk. "I understand you're looking for emergency housing?" I set my garbage bags down and settled into the chair, buying myself a moment to study this woman who'd become a hero to me long before we'd ever met. "Yes, my husband brought me here tonight. He said this was where I belonged." The words came out more bitter than I'd intended. Emily's expression darkened slightly. "I'm sorry to hear that. No one deserves to be abandoned, especially not by someone who's supposed to love and support them. She pulled out a standard intake form. Let's start with the basics. What's your name? Claudia Morrison, I replied, watching carefully for any recognition. There was none, exactly as it should be. All my donations had been made through my late father's foundation, channeled through several intermediary organizations to maintain complete anonymity. Okay, Claudia, do you have any immediate medical needs? Are you feeling safe right now? As Emily walked through the standard questions, medical history, mental health concerns, substance abuse, domestic violence, I found myself genuinely impressed by her thoroughness and sensitivity. Every question was asked with genuine care, every response noted with attention that suggested each person who sat in this chair mattered to her personally. Now, I want you to know that we provide much more than just a place to sleep, Emily continued, pulling out a folder of information. We have job placement services, educational programs, counseling, even legal aid if you need help with divorce proceedings or other issues. The mention of legal aid made me think of the documents hidden in my safety deposit box. Documents Clark knew nothing about, but that was a revelation for another time. The main dormitory has space tonight, and we serve dinner until 8. Tomorrow, we can talk about longer-term options, including our transitional housing program. Emily's voice carried the kind of genuine warmth that couldn't be faked. I want you to know, Claudia, whatever brought you here tonight doesn't define your future. We've helped hundreds of people rebuild their lives, and we're here to help you do the same. I felt an unexpected surge of emotion. Here was this incredible woman, offering hope and dignity to someone she believed had lost everything, never knowing that the person sitting across from her had been quietly ensuring the shelter had the resources to do exactly this work. Through the window, I could see Clark's Mercedes still idling across the street. He was checking his watch now, probably growing impatient. In his mind, this was a calculated move designed to break me, to force me to accept his affair with his secretary Bridget, to make me grateful for whatever scraps of marriage he was willing to offer. What Clark didn't understand was that he'd just handed me the perfect vantage point to watch his world collapse. Emily, I said quietly, before we proceed with the intake, there's something I need to tell you. Something that's going to sound impossible, but I need you to trust me. She leaned forward slightly, her professional demeanor shifting to one of genuine curiosity. Of course, what is it? I took a deep breath, knowing that the next words would change everything. My maiden name is Claudia Hartwell, and for the past 3 years, I've been the anonymous donor funding 60% of this shelter's operating budget. The pen in Emily's hand clattered to the desk. Her eyes widened as she stared at me, processing what I'd just said. I could see her mind racing through the implications. The mysterious benefactor who'd transformed their capabilities, who'd funded the new transitional housing wing, who'd made it possible for them to hire additional counselors and expand their programs. That's impossible, she whispered. The Hartwell Foundation donors are anonymous by design, I finished. But I think it's time that changed. Emily's shock was everything I'd expected and more. But my story didn't start with Clark's cruelty or my secret philanthropy. It began 18 months earlier with my father's sudden death and an inheritance. That would change everything, including the man I thought I'd married. What happened next would test every assumption Clark had made about power, about money, and about the woman he'd so casually discarded on a rainy Tuesday night. The call came at 2:47 a.m. on a Wednesday in March. I remember the exact time because I was staring at the digital clock on my nightstand, unable to sleep due to another one of Clark's emergency work trips that had become increasingly frequent. When my phone rang with the hospital's number, my first thought was relief. Finally, a distraction from wondering which hotel Clark was actually staying at. Mrs. Morrison, this is Dr. Chen at Presbyterian Hospital. I'm afraid I have some difficult news about your father. The words that followed seemed to echo from very far away. Massive heart attack. Did everything we could. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I'm so sorry for your loss. I sat in our empty bedroom, still wearing the silk pajamas Clark had bought me for Christmas, and felt my world tilt sideways. At 68, Dad had been the picture of health, playing tennis twice a week, taking morning walks around his estate, still actively managing the Hartwell Foundation he'd built from nothing. Clark returned from his business trip just in time for the funeral arrangements, full of appropriate sympathy and efficiency. He handled the flowers, the catering, the endless stream of visitors who came to pay their respects to one of the city's most respected philanthropists. I was grateful for his take-charge attitude, too numb with grief to handle the logistics myself. "Don't worry about anything, sweetheart," he whispered during Dad's viewing, his arm protective around my shoulders. "I'll take care of everything. You just focus on saying goodbye." The funeral was a testament to Dad's impact. Hundreds of people packed St. Mary's Cathedral, from business leaders to social workers whose programs he'd quietly funded for decades. Emily Patterson was there, though I didn't know her name at the time. She was just another face in the sea of grateful recipients of Dad's generosity, dabbing her eyes as she listened to the eulogy about a man who'd dedicated his life to lifting others up. After the service, Clark suggested we postpone the will reading. "You're in no state to deal with legal matters," he said reasonably. "Give yourself time to grieve properly." But Dad's attorney, an elderly gentleman named Francis Whitmore, who'd been handling our family's affairs for 30 years, insisted on meeting within the week. "Your father was quite specific about the timing," Mr. Whitmore explained when Clark protested. "He wanted these matters settled quickly to avoid any complications." The reading took place in Mr. Whitmore's downtown office, its dark wood paneling and leather-bound law books creating an atmosphere of old money discretion. Clark sat beside me, holding my hand as Mr. Whitmore adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and opened the thick document that would change everything. "To my beloved daughter Claudia," he began, "I leave my entire estate, including all assets, properties, and controlling interest in the Hartwell Foundation, with the following specific instructions." What followed was breathtaking in its scope. Dad had been worth far more than I'd ever imagined. Not just the family home and modest investments I'd expected, but a portfolio worth over $50 million, built quietly through decades of careful investing and business ventures I'd never known about. The foundation alone controlled assets worth $23 million, making it one of the region's largest private charitable organizations. But it was the next part that would prove most important. All financial decisions regarding the foundation and estate shall be made solely by Claudia Hartwell Morrison, with no requirement for spousal consent or joint signatures. This provision exists to ensure the charitable mission remains focused and protected from external influences. I felt Clark's hand tighten around mine, though his expression remained appropriately solemn. Later, I would understand the significance of that moment. How Dad's lawyer had chosen his words carefully. How the phrase, external influences, had been deliberate. How my father had somehow known to protect me from something I couldn't yet see coming. "There's also this," Mr. Whitmore continued, handing me a sealed envelope marked, "Personal for Claudia only." I opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a handwritten letter in Dad's familiar script. "My dearest Claudia, if you're reading this, then I'm gone sooner than either of us hoped. I've watched you grow into a woman of incredible compassion and strength, and I trust you completely to carry on our family's mission of helping others. But I must share some concerns that have been weighing on my heart. I've observed changes in Clark over the past year that trouble me. His interest in our family's financial affairs has become pronounced. I may be wrong, I hope I am, but I want you to be protected regardless. The foundation's structure will ensure that its charitable mission cannot be compromised, no matter what circumstances you may face. Trust your instincts, sweetheart. You have your mother's wisdom and my stubborn streak. Use both. And remember, true wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in the lives we touch and the difference we make. All my love, Dad P.S. The homeless shelter project you've been advocating for? I've already allocated funds for it. Make it happen. Tears blurred my vision as I folded the letter carefully. Clark was immediately attentive, rubbing my back and murmuring comfort, but I noticed his eyes kept drifting to the documents on Mr. Whitmore's desk. At the time, I interpreted his interest as natural concern for our future. Only later would I realize he was calculating, measuring, planning. The drive home was quiet, Clark's mind clearly processing everything he'd learned. $50 million, he said finally, his voice carefully neutral. I had no idea your father was worth so much. Neither did I admitted. He always lived so modestly. The foundation work will be a big responsibility, Clark continued. Maybe I could help, handle some of the financial oversight, the business decisions, let you focus on the charitable side. Something in his tone made me think of Dad's letter, tucked safely in my purse. Dad was pretty specific about wanting me to handle it personally, I said carefully. Clark's smile was understanding, but I caught something else in his eyes, a flicker of frustration maybe, or calculation. Of course, I just want to support you however I can. That night, I sat in Dad's old study, surrounded by his books and the faint smell of his cologne still clinging to his favorite chair. The weight of responsibility felt overwhelming, not just the money, but the trust Dad had placed in me to continue his work. The homeless shelter Emily now ran had been just a dream then, one of dozens of projects I'd sketched out in my notebook of charitable ideas. Clark brought me tea and sat quietly while I looked through Dad's files, learning about grants to food, banks, scholarship programs for underprivileged kids, medical research funding, and dozens of other initiatives I'd never known about. He really changed a lot of lives, Clark said softly. And now I'm supposed to continue that, I replied, feeling small and inadequate. You will, Clark assured me, kissing the top of my head. We will. Together. At the time, those words felt like a promise. I had no way of knowing they were actually a threat. In the weeks following Dad's funeral, Clark transformed into the husband I'd always dreamed of having. He took a leave of absence from his accounting firm to help me navigate the overwhelming world of estate management and charitable giving. Every morning, he brought me coffee in bed and gently asked about my plans for the day. Every evening, he listened patiently as I shared my struggles with learning the foundation's complex operations. You don't have to carry this alone, he reminded me constantly, his hand warm on my shoulder as I sat hunched over Dad's desk, trying to make sense of grant applications and financial reports. I'm here for whatever you need. The first major decision I faced was whether to continue funding the Metropolitan Food Bank's expansion project, a $3 million commitment Dad had made just weeks before his death. The food bank's director, a passionate woman named Sally Chen, came to our home to plead her case, explaining how the expansion would allow them to serve an additional 5,000 families monthly. I sat in Dad's study, feeling completely out of my depth as Sally spread architectural plans across the coffee table. The numbers were staggering, the responsibility terrifying. What if I made the wrong choice? What if I squandered Dad's life's work on projects that weren't worthy? Clark listened intently to Sally's presentation, asked thoughtful questions about sustainability and impact metrics, then gently guided her to the door with promises that we'd review everything carefully. When we were alone, he sat beside me on Dad's old leather couch and took my hands. What does your heart tell you? He asked softly. Dad believed in this project, I said, my voice shaky. But $3 million. What if I'm wrong? What if there are better uses for the money? Your father chose you for this because he trusted your judgment, Clark replied. brushing a tear from my cheek. And I trust it too. If you think this is what he would have wanted, then that's what we should do. That "we" felt like a lifeline. I signed the approval documents that afternoon, and Clark celebrated by cooking my favorite pasta dinner and opening a bottle of wine Dad had been saving for a special occasion. "To your first major decision as the head of the Hartwell Foundation," he toasted, "and to your father, who would be so proud." The food bank expansion became a tremendous success, feeding thousands of families and earning recognition from the mayor's office. Clark was there for every milestone: the groundbreaking ceremony, the ribbon cutting, the first distribution day. He took photos of me with Sally and the volunteers, sent thank you notes to the construction crew, and even helped serve meals during the inaugural week. "Look at what you've accomplished," he said as we drove home after that first distribution day, my heart full from seeing so many grateful families. "You're changing lives, Claudia, just like your father did." Our marriage felt stronger than it had in years. Clark had always been ambitious and career-focused, sometimes to the point where I felt like an afterthought. But now, he seemed genuinely invested in my work, my dreams, my success. He read every grant proposal with me, attended foundation board meetings as my guest, and even helped me reorganize Dad's filing system into something more manageable. "We should really get you a proper office," he suggested one evening as we worked side by side at the dining room table, surrounded by stacks of paperwork. "Somewhere professional where you can meet with grant recipients and potential donors." The idea hadn't occurred to me, but it made perfect sense. We found a beautiful space in the historic Riverside district. 2 floors of a renovated Victorian mansion with enough room for a small staff and a conference area for board meetings. Clark handled all the lease negotiations, the renovation planning, even the furniture selection. "I want it to reflect your values," he said as we walked through the empty space with the interior designer. "Elegant, but not ostentatious. Professional, but warm. A place where people feel comfortable sharing their stories and their needs." When the Hartwell Foundation's new headquarters opened 6 months after Dad's death, the local newspaper ran a feature story about the young philanthropist carrying on her father's legacy. The photo showed Clark and me standing in the main office, his arm around my waist, both of us smiling at a wall of photos displaying the foundation's impact: the food bank, a scholarship program for disadvantaged youth, a medical research grant that was already showing promising results. "Power couple gives back," read the headline. I loved seeing us described that way, as partners in something meaningful. Clark suggested we host monthly dinner parties for major donors and community leaders, a way to build relationships and inspire additional giving. Our home became a gathering place for the city's philanthropic community. Clark proved to be an excellent host, remembering everyone's names and interests, asking thoughtful questions about their own charitable work, making connections between like-minded people. "Your husband is quite the asset," observed Margaret Thornton, a wealthy widow whose own foundation focused on education. "So supportive, so knowledgeable about your work. You're lucky to have such a partnership." I agreed completely. During those dinner parties, Clark would often stand to offer toasts about the foundation's mission, always crediting Dad's vision and my leadership while humbly positioning himself as simply being grateful to support such important work. He never sought the spotlight for himself, never tried to overshadow my role as the foundation's leader. "Claudia has inherited not just her father's resources, but his heart for service," he would say, raising his glass while I blushed with pride. "I'm just honored to be along for the journey." The homeless shelter project, Dad's final gift to me, began to take shape during this period. I spent weeks researching best practices, visiting existing shelters, and interviewing social workers about the greatest needs in our community. Clark accompanied me on many of these visits, taking notes and asking practical questions about operational costs and staffing requirements. "This is going to be your signature project," he said as we toured a successful shelter in a neighboring city. "The thing that defines your leadership of the foundation." We need to make sure it's perfect. When I first met Emily Patterson, who was then working as an assistant director at another facility, Clark was immediately impressed by her passion and expertise. "She's exactly what your shelter needs," he said after our interview with her. "Someone with experience, vision, and genuine compassion." I offered Emily the director position that same week, with a salary significantly higher than what she'd been earning, and a budget that would allow her to build something truly transformative. The joy on her face when she accepted was one of the most rewarding moments of my life. "You're going to change so many lives," Emily said, tears in her eyes. "Your father would be so proud." Clark squeezed my hand under the table. "We all are," he said warmly. That night, lying in bed with Clark's arm around me, I felt more content than I had since Dad's death. I was honoring his legacy, helping people who needed it most, and doing it all alongside a husband who supported and celebrated every decision I made. I had no idea that Clark was already calculating how to take it all away from me. By the Foundation's first anniversary under my leadership, we had exceeded every goal I'd set. The food bank expansion was serving over 6,000 families monthly. Our scholarship program had sent 43 underprivileged students to college, and the medical research grant had contributed to a breakthrough in pediatric cancer treatment. Most importantly to me, the Riverside Community Shelter was nearing completion, with Emily working around the clock to hire staff and develop programs. The success felt intoxicating. For the first time in my life, I was making decisions that affected thousands of people, and every choice seemed to turn out better than I'd hoped. The local business journal featured me on their 40 under 40 list, calling me a rising force in regional philanthropy with an intuitive understanding of community needs. Clark framed the article and hung it in our kitchen. "Look at you," he said, pulling me close as we admired it together. "A year ago, you were terrified of making one $3 million decision, and now you're running a $23 million foundation like you were born to it." He was right. The overwhelming anxiety I'd felt in those early months had been replaced by growing confidence. I'd learned to read financial reports, evaluate grant proposals, and assess the long-term viability of charitable programs. Board meetings, that had once intimidated me, now felt like collaborative sessions where my voice carried real weight. "I think Dad would be proud," I said, leaning into Clark's embrace. "He'd be amazed," Clark replied. "You've taken everything he built and made it even better." The shelter's grand opening was scheduled for a Saturday in October, exactly 1 year after Dad's death. I wanted it to be perfect, not just as a memorial to him, but as a statement about what the foundation could accomplish. Emily and I spent weeks planning every detail, from the ribbon-cutting ceremony to the community lunch that would introduce neighbors to their new resource. "This is going to be the most comprehensive homeless services facility in the state," Emily told me as we walked through the completed building the week before opening. 60 beds, job training center, mental health services, childcare for parents attending programs, even a small medical clinic. Your father's vision, amplified by your resources. The main dormitory was bright and welcoming, with individual sleeping areas that provided dignity and privacy. The common areas featured comfortable seating, games for children, and a library, stocked with everything from novels to job hunting guides. The kitchen could serve 300 meals a day, and the conference rooms would host everything from AA meetings to financial literacy classes. "It's beautiful," I said, tears in my eyes as I imagined the lives that would be changed within these walls. Dad would have loved seeing it. Clark appeared beside me, having spent the morning reviewing security arrangements with the opening day volunteers. "The mayor's office just confirmed," he said. "She'll be here for the ribbon cutting, along with the city council and the police chief. The newspaper is sending their senior reporter." I felt a flutter of nervousness. This would be my first major public event as the foundation's leader, with media coverage and city officials watching. What if I said something wrong? What if the turnout was disappointing? "You're going to be wonderful," Clark assured me, reading my expression. "This is your moment, Claudia. You've earned it." The morning of the opening dawned crisp and clear, perfect autumn weather that seemed like Dad's blessing. By 10 a.m., a crowd of over 200 people had gathered in front of the shelter. I saw familiar faces from our dinner parties, board, members, city officials, and dozens of community members I didn't recognize who had simply come to support the cause. Emily introduced me with words that made my chest swell with pride. None of this would have been possible without Claudia Morrison, who didn't just continue her father's legacy, but expanded it beyond what any of us thought possible. She saw a need in our community and refused to accept that homelessness was inevitable. Standing at the podium with the bright blue ribbon stretched across the shelter's entrance behind me, I felt my father's presence as clearly as if he were standing beside me. The speech I'd practiced for weeks flowed naturally, my voice strong and clear as I talked about dignity, second chances, and the responsibility we all shared to care for our most vulnerable neighbors. "This shelter represents more than beds and meals," I concluded. "It represents our belief that every person deserves hope, opportunity, and the chance to rebuild their life." My father taught me that true wealth isn't measured by what we accumulate, but by what we give away. Today, we give hope. The applause was thunderous. As I cut the ribbon and the doors officially opened, I felt a surge of accomplishment, unlike anything I'd ever experienced. This was my vision, my project, my contribution to Dad's legacy. Clark was the first to congratulate me, wrapping me in a hug that lifted me off my feet. "I'm so proud of you," he whispered in my ear. "You're incredible." The open house was a tremendous success. Families toured the facilities, volunteers signed up for regular shifts, and several local businesses committed to ongoing partnerships. The mayor pulled me aside to discuss expanding the model to other neighborhoods. A representative from the State Housing Authority asked for copies of our operational plans to share with other communities. "You've created something remarkable." "Here?" said Dr. Patricia Wells, a social work professor who had driven down from the university to see the shelter. "The integration of services, the focus on dignity and empowerment rather than just basic needs. This is going to be studied and replicated across the region." That evening, Clark and I collapsed on our couch, exhausted but exhilarated. The local news had featured the opening as their lead story, with a video clip of my speech and interviews with several people who had already signed up for services. "Look at the comments on the Foundation's social media," Clark said, scrolling through his phone. "Hundreds of people sharing the story, praising your work, offering to volunteer or donate." I curled up against his side, watching the positive responses. For the first time since Dad's death, I felt like I truly belonged in the role he'd left me. The foundation wasn't just something I'd inherited. It was something I was actively building and improving. "What's next?" Clark asked, his arm tightening around me. "Now that you've conquered homelessness?" I laughed at his exaggeration, but I was already thinking about the possibilities. Youth programs, senior services, maybe even expanding beyond our city to help rural communities that lacked resources entirely. "Whatever it is," I said, "I'm ready for it." Clark's smile was warm and encouraging, but something flickered in his eyes that I didn't catch at the time, a calculating look that suggested he was making plans of his own. "I'm sure you are," he said softly. "I'm sure you are." 6 months after the shelter's successful opening, Clark approached me with what seemed like the most romantic gesture of our entire marriage. It was our 13th wedding anniversary, and he had planned an elaborate dinner at Chez Laurent, the French restaurant where he'd proposed all those years ago. "Claudia," he said, taking my hands across the candlelit table, "this past year and a half has shown me what an incredible woman I married. Watching you honor your father's legacy while making it your own has been the privilege of my lifetime." I felt tears welling up. The stress of managing the foundation, combined with the grief that still hit me unexpectedly, had sometimes made me feel like I was drowning. Having Clark acknowledge how hard I'd been working meant everything. "I've been thinking," he continued, pulling out an elegant jewelry box, "about how we can truly become partners in this mission. Not just husband and wife, but equals in building something that will outlast us both." Inside the box was a stunning necklace, a delicate gold chain with a pendant shaped like a key. "It's beautiful," I breathed, but I was confused about the symbolism. "The key represents access," Clark explained, his eyes earnest and warm. "Access to everything you've built, everything your father entrusted to you. I want to be your true partner in this work, Claudia. Not just supportive from the sidelines, but actively involved in shaping the foundation's future." I fastened the necklace around my throat, the pendant cool against my skin. "What do you mean exactly?" Clark reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick folder. "I've been working with Francis Whitmore on some legal documents that would make me co-director of the Hartwell Foundation. Full partnership, joint decision-making authority, shared access to all accounts and assets." My fork paused halfway to my mouth. This was not what I'd expected for our anniversary dinner. "Clark, I know it's a big decision," he said quickly, covering my free hand with his. "But think about it. You've been carrying this enormous responsibility alone for over a year. Wouldn't it be easier to share that burden with someone who loves you? Someone who's been there for every success, every challenge?" The weight of the foundation's responsibilities had been overwhelming at times. Board meetings, financial oversight, grant reviews, donor relations. It never ended. The idea of having a true partner, someone with equal authority to help shoulder the load, was undeniably appealing. "But Dad specifically left the foundation to me," I said slowly. "The will was very clear about maintaining sole control." "That was before you were married to someone who's proven himself," Clark replied smoothly. "Your father couldn't have anticipated how much I'd grow into this role, how invested I'd become in the mission. Besides, this doesn't change your father's intent. It just ensures the foundation has strong leadership for generations to come." I looked around the elegant restaurant, at other couples celebrating anniversaries and special occasions, and felt a pang of longing for the simplicity they seemed to have. Their biggest decision tonight was probably choosing between the chocolate, soufflé, and the crème brûlée. "The foundation means everything to me," I said carefully. "It's Dad's legacy, which is exactly why it deserves two committed leaders instead of one," Clark said. "Think about what we could accomplish together. You have the vision and the heart. I have the business acumen and the strategic thinking. We'd be unstoppable." That word, unstoppable, sent a little thrill through me. We had been a good team this past year. Clark's suggestions had often improved my initial ideas, and his connections in the business community had opened doors I couldn't have accessed alone. "Francis reviewed all the legal implications," Clark continued, sensing my wavering. "The transition would be seamless. All existing grants and commitments would continue unchanged. The only difference would be that you'd have a true partner instead of carrying everything alone." I thought about the sleepless nights I'd spent worrying about whether I was making the right decisions with money that could change thousands of lives, the constant second-guessing, the fear that I might disappoint Dad's memory or fail the people counting on the foundation's support. "I don't know," I said finally. "This is such a big decision. I need time to think about it." Clark's smile faltered slightly, but he recovered quickly. "Of course. I just want you to know that I'm ready to make that commitment, ready to dedicate my life to this mission the way you have." On the drive home, the key pendant seemed heavier against my chest. Clark was quiet, letting me process, but I could feel the expectation radiating from him. When we pulled into our driveway, he turned to face me. "I love you, Claudia," he said softly. "And I love what we've built together. I just want to make it official, make us true partners in every sense." That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling while Clark slept peacefully beside me. The foundation document sat on my nightstand, unread, but somehow ominous in the darkness. Part of me wanted to wake Clark and tell him yes, to share this burden that sometimes felt too heavy for one person. But another part of me, a part that sounded suspiciously like Dad's voice, whispered a warning I couldn't quite articulate. The morning, I would make a decision that would change everything. But lying there in the pre-dawn darkness, I had no idea which path would lead to my salvation and which would lead to my destruction. The key pendant caught the moonlight streaming through our bedroom window, glinting like a promise or a threat. Against my better judgment, I signed the co-directorship papers 3 days later. Clark's arguments had worn me down, and the exhaustion of carrying the foundation's weight alone finally overcame my reservations. The signing ceremony took place in Francis Whitmore's office, with the elderly lawyer looking distinctly uncomfortable as he witnessed my signature. "Your father was very specific about his wishes," Mr. Whitmore said quietly as I handed back the pen. "I want you to know that if you ever change your mind about this arrangement, the original will provisions can be restored." "That won't be necessary," Clark interjected smoothly, his hand possessive on my shoulder. "We're in this together now." The changes started immediately, but so subtly that I almost didn't notice them at first. Clark began arriving at the foundation office before me most mornings, claiming he wanted to review the day's agenda and prepare briefing materials. When I arrived, he'd greet me with coffee and a warm smile, along with a stack of documents he'd already reviewed. "I flagged the 3 grant applications that need your attention," he'd say. "And I've already handled the routine renewals. No need for you to waste time on the simple stuff." At first, I was grateful. The routine renewals had always been tedious, reviewing reports from established recipients, verifying their continued compliance with grant terms, authorizing the next quarterly payments. Having Clark handle those freed me up to focus on the more complex new applications and strategic planning. But gradually, I realized that Clark's definition of routine was expanding. Decisions that I would have considered significant, like approving budget increases for existing programs or authorizing equipment purchases, were being made without my input. The food bank needed new refrigeration units, Clark explained when I discovered a $20,000 expenditure I hadn't approved. Sally called this morning, and they were going to lose a whole shipment of frozen meals if we didn't act immediately. I didn't want to bother you while you were in that important meeting with the university. His explanation made sense, and Sally confirmed the urgency when I called to check. But something nagged at me about the pattern that was emerging. Clark was increasingly positioned as the foundation's operational leader while I was relegated to the role of visionary figurehead. The shift became more apparent during our monthly board meetings. Clark had always attended as my guest, but now he sat at my right hand with his own agenda and stack of reports. He spoke with authority about financial projections, operational efficiency, and strategic partnerships that I was only hearing about for the first time. "Clark's been invaluable in streamlining our processes," observed board member Henry Richardson during one particularly contentious discussion about overhead costs. "His business background is exactly what we needed to professionalize our operations." I noticed that Henry directed his comments to Clark rather than to me, despite the fact that I was supposedly chairing the meeting. Other board members began following suit, asking Clark for clarification on budget items or seeking his opinion on program effectiveness. "Perhaps we should establish clearer roles," I suggested after one meeting where I'd felt more like an observer than a leader. "Define which decisions require both signatures versus which can be handled individually." Clark's expression remained supportive, but I caught a flash of something else, irritation, maybe, or calculation. "Of course, whatever makes you more comfortable. Though I have to say, the current system has been working well. Our response time to urgent requests has improved significantly." He was right about that. Our beneficiaries had been praising our increased efficiency and responsiveness. Emily, in particular, had mentioned how quickly the foundation now addressed operational issues at the shelter. When the heating system had failed in January, Clark had authorized the emergency repairs, within hours rather than waiting for our next scheduled meeting. But I was beginning to feel like a stranger in my own organization. Staff members who had once brought questions directly to me now approached Clark first. New partnerships were being discussed and sometimes agreed to before I knew they existed. Grant applications that didn't align with Clark's vision of strategic focus seemed to disappear from consideration without reaching my desk. "We should really standardize our grant criteria," Clark suggested during one of our weekly planning sessions. "Create clear guidelines about what types of projects align with our mission and which fall outside our scope." Dad always said flexibility was one of our strengths, I replied. Being able to respond to unexpected needs and innovative approaches. "Your father built a wonderful foundation," Clark said patiently. "But times have changed. We're managing much larger sums now, with greater public scrutiny. We need to be more strategic, more disciplined in our approach." The word disciplined stung. Was he implying that my leadership had been undisciplined? That Dad's approach had been somehow lacking? I started paying closer attention to the foundation's day-to-day operations, arriving earlier and staying later to review documents that Clark had pre-screened. What I found troubled me. Several grant applications that I remembered being enthusiastic about had been rejected without my knowledge. A homeless youth program that seemed perfectly aligned with our mission had been declined for being too specialized. When I questioned Clark about these decisions, he had reasonable explanations for each one. Budget constraints, regulatory concerns, questions about organizational capacity. But taken together, they painted a picture of a foundation becoming more conservative and less innovative under his influence. The breaking point came during a casual conversation with Emily about the shelter's expansion plans. She mentioned being disappointed that the foundation had declined to fund the new women's transitional housing wing. "What declined funding?" I asked, confused. "I never saw that proposal." Emily looked surprised. "Clark said you'd reviewed it, but felt it was outside the foundation's current strategic focus. He suggested we reapply next year with a modified approach." That evening, I confronted Clark in his home office. Why didn't I see Emily's proposal for the transitional housing? He didn't look up from his computer. Because it was a $50,000 ask for a program that would only serve 12 women annually. The cost per beneficiary was astronomical. "That's not your decision to make alone," I said, my voice sharper than intended. Clark finally turned to face me, and for just a moment, I saw something cold in his eyes. "Actually, according to the operational guidelines we established, grants under $75,000 can be approved or declined by either co-director. I was saving you from having to waste time on an obviously inefficient proposal." I stood there, realizing that I'd signed away more than I'd understood. Somewhere in the legal documents that had made Clark my equal partner, there were provisions I'd missed or hadn't fully grasped. Clauses that were now being used to exclude me from decisions about the foundation Dad had entrusted solely to me. "From now on," I said carefully, "I want to see everything. Every proposal, every decision, every expenditure." Clark's smile was patient but patronizing. "Of course. Though I hope you'll trust that I'm only trying to protect the foundation's resources and reputation." As I walked back to our bedroom, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just lost something important. The key pendant Clark had given me felt heavy around my neck, not like access to power, but like a chain binding me to decisions I was no longer free to make. The discovery came 3 months later, during what should have been a routine evening at home. Clark was working late at the foundation office, or so he'd told me, and I was catching up on reading grant applications in Dad's old study. The house felt too quiet, too empty, and I found myself missing the early days of our partnership when we'd review everything together. I decided to call Clark and suggest grabbing late dinner when he finished up. His phone went straight to voicemail, which wasn't unusual given how focused he became when working on financial reports. But when I tried the foundation office landline, it rang and rang with no answer. Maybe he'd already left and was driving home with his phone on silent. I settled back into Dad's leather chair with a cup of tea, intending to wait for Clark's headlights in the driveway. That's when I heard his voice drifting up from the basement. Our basement had been converted into a home office years ago, complete with a separate phone line that Clark used for his consulting work. I'd assumed he'd abandoned that business when he became co-director of the foundation, but apparently he'd maintained some clients. At first, I didn't pay attention to the muffled conversation below. Clark often took calls in the basement when he didn't want to disturb me, but something about his tone, urgent and secretive, made me pause in my reading. I crept to the top of the basement stairs, feeling foolish for eavesdropping on my own husband, but unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong. "Told you not to call me at home," Clark was saying, his voice sharp with irritation. "We discussed this. Everything has to go through the proper channels now." A pause as the person on the other end responded. "No, she doesn't suspect anything yet," Clark continued. "But Claudia's more observant than you think. The documentation has to be perfect, or she'll start asking questions we can't answer." My blood turned to ice. Documentation about what? Questions. About what? "Look, Sebastian," Clark said, and I nearly gasped aloud at the name. Sebastian Morrison, Clark's younger brother, whom I'd always liked but barely saw anymore. "The foundation grants have to look legitimate. We can't just funnel money to your development company without proper justification." Development company? Sebastian worked in real estate, but I had no idea he owned a development company. And more importantly, what grants was Clark referring to? I reviewed every grant application personally, at least I thought I did. "I don't care if you need the money faster," Clark snapped. "We stick to the timeline. 6 months of documented homeless services in the downtown district. Then we apply for the infrastructure improvement grant. It has to look like organic community development, not a scheme to line your pockets." My legs gave out, and I sank onto the top step, my heart pounding so loudly I was afraid Clark would hear it downstairs. He was talking about creating fake charitable programs to justify grants that would somehow benefit Sebastian's business. This wasn't just questionable accounting. This was fraud. "Bridget's been handling the paperwork," Clark continued, and I felt another shock of recognition. Bridget Allen, the ambitious young program coordinator we'd hired 6 months ago. She'd impressed me with her attention to detail and apparent passion for homeless advocacy. She set up the documentation for the pilot program. Photos, testimonials, progress reports, everything Claudia would expect to see. The basement had gone quiet, and I realized Clark was listening to whatever Sebastian was saying. I held my breath, afraid to move. "Fine," Clark said finally. "But this is the last time we accelerate the timeline. And tell Bridget to be more careful with the financial reports. Claudia's been asking more questions lately about spending patterns. More questions because I'd been systematically excluded from decisions," I thought bitterly. Because the foundation's work was becoming unrecognizable. Under Clark's leadership, once the downtown development project is approved, we'll have enough legitimate contracts to justify the larger grants, Clark continued. But until then, everything has to be by the book. Claudia may be naive about business, but she's not stupid. Naive? About business. The phrase cut deep, especially coming from someone who'd supposedly respected and supported my vision for the foundation. I heard Clark's footsteps moving toward the basement stairs and panicked. I crept quickly back to Dad's study, my hands shaking as I tried to look absorbed in the grant application I'd been reading. By the time Clark emerged from the basement, I was sitting exactly as he'd left me, though my heart was still racing. "Hey, sweetheart," he said, appearing in the doorway with that familiar warm smile that now seemed like a mask. I didn't hear you come in. I've been here all evening, I replied, proud of how steady my voice sounded. I tried calling you at the office, but no one answered. Must have been when I stepped out for dinner, he said smoothly. Lost track of time reviewing the quarterly budget projections. Every word felt like another betrayal. He was lying to my face about where he'd been, about what he'd been doing, about everything. How did the projections look? I asked, testing him. Good, mostly. A few adjustments needed in the community development allocation, but nothing major. He moved behind my chair and began massaging my shoulders, a gesture that had always comforted me but now felt manipulative. You've been working too hard lately. Why don't you let me handle the evening reviews? I wanted to scream, to confront him immediately about what I'd overheard, but something held me back. Maybe Dad's voice warning me to be careful. Maybe my own instinct for self-preservation. Clark was clearly involved in something illegal, and he had an accomplice inside the foundation itself. If I confronted him now, without proof, he'd simply deny everything and become more careful about hiding his activities. That sounds nice, I managed to say. I am pretty tired. As Clark continued rubbing my shoulders, talking casually about his plans for tomorrow's meetings, I felt like I was seeing him clearly for the first time in months. The man I'd trusted with Dad's legacy, the husband I'd thought was supporting my dreams, was systematically stealing from the foundation and lying to my face about it. That night, I lay awake beside him, watching him sleep peacefully as if he hadn't a care in the world. Every breath, every slight movement felt like another deception. I thought about Dad's warning letter, about Francis Whitmore's concerns, about all the small signs I'd ignored or rationalized away. By morning, I'd made a decision. I couldn't confront Clark directly. Not yet. But I could start my own investigation. I could gather evidence of whatever scheme he was running with Sebastian and Bridget. And then I could decide how to protect the foundation Dad had entrusted to me. The key pendant felt cold against my throat as I watched the sunrise through our bedroom window. Clark had given it to me as a symbol of partnership, but now I understood what it really represented, the key to his plan to steal everything Dad had worked for. But two could play at this game. If Clark thought I was naive about business, he was about to learn just how wrong he could be. My investigation into Clark's activities began the very next morning. I arrived at the foundation office earlier than usual, determined to review every document Bridget Allen had filed in the past 6 months. What I discovered made my stomach turn. Bridget had been busy creating an elaborate fiction. Buried in routine quarterly reports were references to a downtown outreach initiative that I'd never approved or even heard of. According to her meticulously crafted documentation, the foundation had been funding a pilot program providing mobile services to homeless individuals in the business district, exactly the area where Sebastian's development company would logically want to expand. The paperwork was flawless. Professional photographs showed volunteers distributing meals and blankets to people I didn't recognize. Testimonials praised the program's effectiveness in connecting homeless individuals with permanent housing solutions. Financial reports detailed expenses for staff, supplies, and transportation that totaled nearly $200,000 over 6 months. None of it existed. I knew this because I personally visited every homeless service provider in the city. None of them had heard of our downtown outreach initiative. The supposed beneficiaries in the photographs were stock images I found with a reverse Google search. The addresses listed for the mobile service locations were either vacant lots or business parking garages. "Good morning, Claudia." Bridget's voice made me jump. I looked up to find her standing in my office doorway, her blonde hair perfectly styled, her professional smile not quite reaching her eyes. "You're here early today." "Catching up on some reading," I replied, casually closing the file folder I'd been reviewing. "I wanted to understand our programs better. Bridget stepped into my office without invitation, her heels clicking on the hardwood floor. She was younger than me by at least 5 years, with the kind of polished confidence that came from expensive schools and well-connected family. When Clark had hired her, I'd been impressed by her credentials and apparent passion for social justice. Now I wondered if everything about her was as fabricated as her program reports. "I noticed you've been pulling files on several of our community initiatives," she said, settling into the chair across from my desk. "I'd be happy to brief you on any programs you have questions about." The offer sounded helpful, but her tone carried an undercurrent I couldn't identify. Warning? Threat? "Actually, I was just reading about the Downtown Outreach Initiative," I said, watching her face carefully. "Impressive results for such a new program." Bridget's smile never wavered, but I caught a slight tightening around her eyes. "Thank you. It's been incredibly rewarding work. The homeless population in that area has such complex needs." "I'd love to see the program in action," I continued. "Maybe I could join you on one of the mobile outreach visits?" "Oh, that would be wonderful," Bridget replied smoothly. Unfortunately, we just wrapped up the pilot phase last week. We're currently analyzing the data before proposing the full-scale implementation. Of course they were. How convenient that the program had ended just as I'd started asking questions. "I see Clark's been very supportive of your work," I said, deciding to push a little harder. "He speaks very highly of your initiative." "Clark's been an incredible mentor," Bridget said, and something in the way she said his name made my skin crawl. "He really understands the importance of innovative approaches to persistent social problems." There was an intimacy in her tone that went beyond professional admiration. I thought about Clark's late nights at the office, his phone calls that went straight to voicemail, his distracted behavior at home. Was Bridget involved in more than just his fraudulent schemes? "Well, I'm glad you two are working so closely together," I managed to say. "We make a good team," she replied, standing to leave. Clark has such vision for where the foundation could go. Sometimes the most impactful changes require flexibility in how we approach traditional philanthropy. After she left, I sat staring at the empty doorway, my hands shaking with anger. The audacity of it, discussing her conspiracy with my husband right in front of me, confident that I was too naive or trusting to understand what was happening. I spent the rest of the morning researching Sebastian's development company. Morrison Development, LLC had been incorporated just 8 months ago, shortly after Clark became co-director of the foundation. Their only listed project was a proposed mixed-use complex in the downtown district, the exact area where Bridget's fictional outreach program had supposedly been operating. The timeline was damning. Sebastian forms a development company. Clark pushes for strategic partnerships with community development initiatives. Bridget creates fraudulent documentation to justify grants for downtown homeless services. And soon, I was certain, there would be an application for a major infrastructure grant to support community-responsive development that would primarily benefit Sebastian's project. They had been planning this for months, maybe longer. Using Dad's foundation, using me, to fund Clark's family business ventures while hiding behind the veneer of charitable work. When Clark arrived at the office that afternoon, he greeted me with his usual warm smile and a cup of my favorite coffee. "How's your day going, sweetheart? I heard you were asking Bridget about some of our programs." The casual mention told me they'd already discussed my questions. They were coordinating their responses, making sure their stories aligned. Just trying to stay more involved, I replied. "You were right about needing to understand all our initiatives better." "I'm glad to hear it," Clark said, though his eyes were watchful. "Though I hope you're not taking on too much. You've seemed stressed lately." It was gaslighting, pure and simple. Make me question my own perceptions, my own instincts, my own right to oversee the foundation Dad had left to me. "I'm fine," I said firmly. "Actually, I'm thinking about doing some field visits, really seeing our programs in action. Clark's smile tightened slightly. That sounds like a great idea, though you know how much the program directors appreciate advance notice. Some of our beneficiaries can be sensitive about unexpected visitors. Another smooth deflection. Another reason why I couldn't simply show up unannounced to verify their claims. That evening, I made a decision that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. I was going to hire a private investigator to document Clark's activities. I was going to gather enough evidence to not only protect the foundation, but potentially send my husband to prison for fraud. As I lay in bed that night, listening to Clark's steady breathing beside me, I felt like I was mourning the death of my marriage. The man I'd loved and trusted for 13 years was gone, replaced by a stranger who saw me as nothing more than an obstacle to overcome or a resource to exploit. The key pendant lay cold against my throat, and I finally understood its true meaning. Clark hadn't given me access to power. He'd given me the key to my own destruction. But what he didn't realize was that I still held the master key to everything Dad had built, and I intended to use it. The private investigator I hired was a former police detective named Marcus Webb, professional, discreet, and recommended by Francis Whitmore's law firm for sensitive family matters. Within 2 weeks, he'd confirmed what I already suspected and uncovered details that made my betrayal even more complete. Clark and Bridget weren't just business partners. They were having an affair. Marcus's surveillance photos showed them entering hotels together, sharing intimate dinners at restaurants across town, even looking at apartments in the expensive Riverside district. They weren't trying very hard to hide it, which told me they were confident I'd never find out. More damaging were the financial records Marcus had obtained through contacts at the bank. Clark had opened personal accounts that I knew nothing about, accounts that received regular transfers from foundation grants to fictional programs. The money trail led directly to Sebastian's development company, to Bridget's personal expenses, and to a lifestyle that far exceeded what Clark's foundation salary could support. But the most devastating discovery was the timeline. The affair had begun before Dad's death, before Clark had become my supportive partner through grief. His transformation into the perfect husband hadn't been love or growth. It had been a calculated performance designed to position himself for this theft. I was studying Marcus's report in Dad's old study when Clark appeared in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "We need to talk," he said, closing the door behind him. My heart hammered as I casually slid the investigator's photos under a stack of grant applications. "Of course. What about?" Clark sat across from me, his posture tense in a way I'd never seen before. "I've been hearing some concerning things, Claudia, about you asking questions, making phone calls to verify programs, pulling financial records." "I'm the foundation director," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "Those are my responsibilities." "They're our responsibilities," Clark corrected, his tone sharper than usual. "And frankly, your behavior is starting to concern the board." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What do you mean?" "Henry Richardson called me yesterday. He's worried about your mental state, your obsession with micromanaging, your apparent paranoia about perfectly legitimate programs." Clark's expression was sympathetic, but his eyes were cold. "He thinks the stress of managing the foundation might be affecting your judgment." The manipulation was breathtaking. Clark was using the board, people who'd known and respected my father, to gaslight me about my own competence. "I'm not paranoid," I said carefully. "I'm being thorough." "Are you?" Clark leaned forward, his voice taking on the patronizing tone I'd come to hate. "Because Bridget mentioned you've been asking some very strange questions about the downtown outreach initiative. Questions that suggest you don't trust the documentation, don't trust her work, don't trust me." They were closing ranks, presenting a united front against my unreasonable suspicions. Soon, I realized they'd have enough board support to have me declared incompetent to manage the foundation. Maybe I should talk to the board myself, I suggested. Clark's smile was cold. I think that would be an excellent idea. In fact, I've already scheduled a meeting for Friday afternoon. A chance for everyone to air their concerns and work together towards solutions. My mouth went dry. A board meeting I hadn't scheduled about concerns I wasn't supposed to know about, with outcomes already predetermined. This was how Clark intended to remove me entirely. Not through direct confrontation, but through institutional manipulation. I see, I managed to say. Claudia, I want you to know that despite everything, I still care about you, Clark continued, reaching across the desk to take my hand. His touch felt like ice. The foundation was your father's life work, and I know how much it means to you. But maybe it's time to consider whether the stress is worth it, whether you might be happier stepping back, letting others handle the day-to-day operations. Others like you and Bridget? Clark's mask slipped for just a moment, and I saw something predatory in his expression. Like people who can maintain professional objectivity, who can work collaboratively instead of creating conflict and suspicion. After he left, I sat staring at the closed door, finally understanding the full scope of what I was facing. This wasn't just about money or even the affair. Clark intended to steal the foundation entirely, to have me declared incompetent so he could run Dad's legacy as his personal slush fund. I called Marcus Webb immediately. I need everything accelerated, I told him. Financial records, evidence of the affair, documentation of the fraudulent programs. And I need it before Friday. That's only 3 days, Marcus warned. Then we work fast. Because after Friday, it might be too late. The next 3 days passed in a blur of covert evidence gathering. I accessed foundation accounts from home, downloading financial records and grant applications before Clark could restrict my access. I photographed documents, copied files, and assembled a comprehensive picture of the fraud that had been perpetrated. Under my nose, Emily called Wednesday evening, her voice concerned. Claudia, I hope you don't mind me asking, but is everything okay with the foundation? Clark mentioned there might be some restructuring. My blood ran cold. He was already preparing our beneficiaries for my departure. What kind of restructuring? I asked. He wasn't specific, just said there might be changes in leadership, new priorities, different approaches to grant making. Emily paused. I have to say, it doesn't sound like the vision you shared with me when we started the shelter. Emily, whatever you hear in the coming days, I want you to know that I've never stopped believing in the work we're doing together. There was silence, on the other end of the line. Then Emily said quietly, Claudia, if you need anything at all, please call me. Your father was good to a lot of people in this city. We don't forget that kind of loyalty. Thursday night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about Dad, about his warning letter, about how he'd somehow known to protect the foundation from external influences. He'd tried to safeguard his life's work, but I'd handed it over to the very person he'd warned me about. Friday. Morning arrived with unseasonable rain, as if the weather was reflecting my mood. I dressed carefully in my most professional suit, the one Dad had always said made me look like a CEO. I clasped my mother's pearl necklace around my throat, leaving the key pendant Clark had given me on my dresser. I wouldn't be wearing his symbol of false partnership to my own execution. The board meeting was scheduled for 2 o'clock. I had 6 hours to decide whether to fight or flee, to expose Clark's crimes or accept defeat gracefully. By noon, I'd made my choice. If Clark wanted a war, for control of Dad's foundation, he was going to get one. But he'd underestimated the woman he'd betrayed, just like he'd underestimated the father who'd raised her. The foundation was about to learn what happened when you tried to steal from a heart well. The board meeting that would determine my fate was still 3 hours away when I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of waiting passively for Clark's ambush, I was going to confront him with the evidence I'd gathered. Not to save our marriage, that was already dead, but to give him one chance to confess before I destroyed him publicly. I found Clark in his office, reviewing what looked like talking points for the afternoon meeting. When I walked in and closed the door behind me, he looked up with that practiced smile that no longer fooled me. "Claudia, sweetheart, I know about Sebastian's development company," I said quietly, placing Marcus Webb's surveillance photos on his desk. "I know about the fake downtown outreach initiative. I know about the money you've been stealing from Dad's foundation." Clark's face went completely still as he stared at the photographs, images of him and Bridget entering hotels, sharing intimate dinners, kissing in parking garages. When he looked up, the mask he'd worn for so long was finally gone. "How long have you known?" he asked, his voice flat. "Long enough." I sat in the chair across from him, surprised by how calm I felt. "The question is, how long has this been going on?" Clark leaned back in his chair, studying me with what looked like genuine curiosity. "You really want to know? I think I deserve the truth, don't you?" A bitter laugh escaped him. "The truth? The truth is that I've been planning this since before your father died." The words hit me like a physical blow, even though I'd suspected as much. "Before? Do you think it was coincidence that I happened to be so supportive during your grief? So helpful with the funeral arrangements? So eager to assist with the foundation?" Clark's voice carried a cruelty I'd never heard before. "I knew your father was sick months before that heart attack. His doctor was Sebastian's golf partner." My hands clenched into fists. "You knew Dad was dying and you—" "I prepared," Clark interrupted. "I positioned myself to be indispensable to his grieving daughter. I became the perfect husband, the ideal partner, the man you could lean on when the world collapsed around. You, and Bridget, was already in the picture. We met at a conference 2 years ago, started the affair about 6 months before your father's convenient death. She was getting her master's in nonprofit management. Perfect credentials for what we had planned. I felt sick. Every moment of comfort Clark had provided, every gesture of support, every word of encouragement had been calculated manipulation. The co-directorship was always the goal," Clark continued, seeming almost relieved to finally tell the truth. "Your father's will was ironclad. I couldn't touch the foundation as your husband. But as co-director, well, you signed away quite a bit of control, didn't you?" "Why?" The question came out as barely a whisper. "Why do this to me? To Dad's legacy?" Clark's expression grew genuinely puzzled, as if the question didn't make sense. $23 million, Claudia. Do you have any idea what that kind of money can do? The opportunities it opens, the life it can buy? It's not your money. It belongs to the people Dad wanted to help." "Your father was a sentimental fool," Clark snapped, his composure finally cracking. "All that money wasted on homeless shelters and food banks, on people who'll never contribute anything meaningful to society. I saw the potential for something bigger, something that could actually generate wealth instead of just giving it away." "You mean something that could generate wealth for you?" "For us," Clark corrected. "At least it could have been. If you'd been smarter, if you'd been willing to see the bigger picture instead of clinging to your father's outdated idealism." I stared at this stranger wearing my husband's face, trying to reconcile the man I'd thought I married with the cold sociopath sitting across from me. "The foundation has helped thousands of people," I said. "And it could have made millions," Clark replied. "Real estate development, strategic investments, corporate partnerships. There were so many ways to leverage that money for actual growth instead of charity. You're talking about destroying everything Dad built. I'm talking about evolving it, making it relevant to the modern world instead of some Victorian notion of noblesse oblige." I stood up, no longer able to sit in the same room with him. "You're talking about theft." Clark stood as well, moving around the desk to face me. For a moment, I saw something that might have been regret in his eyes. It didn't have to be this way, he said softly. If you'd trusted me, if you'd been willing to share real power instead of just the title, we could have built something incredible together. Built on lies and fraud, built on vision and opportunity. His voice hardened again. But you couldn't see past your father's sentimental attachment to lost causes. Those lost causes are people, Clark. Real people with real needs. Those lost causes are a drain on resources that could be used productively. I turned toward the door, unable to listen to any more. This conversation is over. Is it? Clark's voice stopped me. Because in about 2 hours, you're going to walk into that boardroom where Henry Richardson and the others are waiting to hear about your mental breakdown, your paranoid accusations, your inability to handle the pressures of leadership. I turned, back to face him. Not anymore. Oh, but I think so. You see, even if you share those photos, even if you make wild accusations about fraud, who do you think the board will believe? The stable, professional co-director who's streamlined operations and improved efficiency? Or the increasingly erratic widow who's been making strange accusations and creating workplace tension? His confidence was breathtaking. Even caught red-handed, he believed he could manipulate the situation in his favor. You might be surprised, I said quietly. Clark's smile was patronizing. Claudia, you've always been too trusting, too naive about how power really works. That's what made this so easy. As I reached for the door handle, Clark spoke one more time. Oh, and sweetheart, you might want to know that after the board removes you this afternoon, Bridget and I have already planned our honeymoon. We're thinking the Maldives. Your father's foundation will be paying for it, of course. I walked out, without another word. But inside I was burning with a cold, focused rage that would have made Dad proud. Clark thought he'd won. He thought I was still the naive, trusting woman he'd married. He was about to learn how wrong he could be. What happened next should have been my complete destruction. Instead, it became the moment I realized that Clark had made one critical miscalculation. He'd assumed I would react like the grieving, trusting woman he'd manipulated for the past 18 months. He had no idea that his confession had awakened something in me that I'd inherited from Dad, a steel core that emerged only when everything I loved was threatened. I left Clark's office with 90 minutes before the board meeting that was supposed to end my involvement with the foundation. Instead of panicking or preparing for defeat, I spent that time making phone calls to people Clark didn't know I could reach. The first call was to Francis Whitmore. I need you at the foundation board. Meeting this afternoon, I told him, as legal counsel for the original estate and foundation charter. Claudia, I don't understand. Clark told me the meeting was canceled. Clark lied. About that and about many other things. Can you be here by 2 o'clock? There was a pause. Yes, of course. Should I bring anything specific? Dad's original. Foundation documents? And the addendum he added 6 months before his death, the one about moral conduct clauses. The second call was to Marcus Webb. I need you at the Hartwell Foundation at 1:45 p.m. Bring everything. Photos, financial records, the complete evidence file. Are you sure about this, Mrs. Morrison? Once this comes out, there's no going back. There was no going back the moment. My husband decided to steal from dying children and homeless families. The third call was the hardest. I dialed Emily's direct line at the shelter. Emily, I need to ask you something important. Has anyone from the foundation contacted you about changes to our funding arrangement? Actually, yes. Bridget called yesterday. She said there might be some restructuring of grants, possibly reducing our allocation by 60% starting next quarter. Emily's voice was tight with worry. She mentioned budget constraints and new priorities. My jaw clenched. They were already planning to cut funding to legitimate programs to cover the money they'd stolen and intended to steal. Emily, I need you to trust me. Can you be at the foundation office at 2 o'clock today? I can't explain everything over the phone, but I need witnesses to what's about to happen. Witnesses to what? To the truth about what's been happening to Dad's foundation. When I arrived at the boardroom 15 minutes before the meeting, I found Henry Richardson and 3 other board members already seated, looking uncomfortable. Clark was there too, along with Bridget, both wearing expressions of professional concern mixed with barely concealed satisfaction. "Claudia," Henry said, rising to greet me. "Thank you for coming. I know this is difficult, but we all care about you and want what's best for the foundation." "I appreciate that, Henry. I hope you'll keep that in mind during today's discussion." Clark checked his watch with theatrical concern. "Should we begin? I know everyone has busy schedules." "Actually, we're waiting for a few more people," I said. Taking my seat at the head of the table, the chair that had been my father's, the position Clark had been systematically trying to undermine. "More people?" Bridget asked, her voice carefully neutral but her eyes sharp with alarm. "Our legal counsel, for one, and several foundation stakeholders who have a right to hear what we're discussing today." Clark's confident expression flickered. "Claudia, this is a private board matter. We don't need outside." The conference room. Docker opened and Francis Whitmore entered, carrying a thick briefcase and wearing the gravely serious expression I remembered from Dad's funeral. Behind him came Marcus Webb, followed by Emily Patterson. "What is the meaning of this?" Henry demanded, looking between Clark and me. "The meaning," I said, standing up and removing a thick folder from my briefcase, "is that this board has been systematically deceived about the foundation's operations, its finances, and the character of its co-director." Bridget had gone pale, but Clark maintained his composure. "Henry, this is exactly what I was concerned about. Claudia's been making increasingly erratic accusations." "About fraudulent programs," I interrupted, placing Marcus Webb's photographs on the table. "About embezzled funds. About affairs conducted with foundation employees." I spread the surveillance photos across the polished wood surface. "About conspiracies to steal money meant for homeless children and dying cancer patients." The silence in the room was deafening. Henry picked up one of the photos showing Clark and Bridget kissing outside a hotel, his face registering shock and disgust. These are faked," Clark said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Are they?" I turned to Marcus. "Mr. Webb, would you please explain to the board how you obtained these photographs?" Marcus stepped forward, his professional demeanor commanding immediate attention. "I'm a licensed private investigator. These photographs were taken over a 2-week period using standard surveillance techniques. I can provide detailed logs of dates, times, and locations for each image." Board member Patricia Wells was examining financial documents I'd provided. "Claudia, what am I looking at here?" Evidence that the Downtown Outreach Initiative, which the foundation supposedly funded to the tune of $200,000, never existed. The beneficiaries in the program reports are stock photos. The addresses are vacant lots. Every penny went to personal accounts controlled by Clark and Bridget. Emily gasped. "That's impossible." "Clark told me that program was one of your most successful initiatives." "Clark told you a lot of things," I replied, "including that the foundation was planning to cut your funding by 60%. What he didn't tell you was that the money was being diverted to his brother's development company." For the first time, Clark looked genuinely rattled. "You can't prove any of this." "Can't I?" I nodded to Francis Whitmore, who opened his briefcase and removed a thick legal document. "Ladies and gentlemen," Francis announced, his voice carrying, "the authority of 30 years practicing law. I hold in my hands a moral conduct addendum to the original foundation charter, signed by Frank Hartwell 6 months before his death. This addendum specifically states that any foundation director found to have engaged in fraud, embezzlement, or breach of fiduciary duty shall be immediately removed and subject to full criminal prosecution." Clark shot to his feet. "This is ridiculous. You can't—" "Sit down," Henry commanded, his voice thunderous. The mild-mannered businessman who'd been Dad's golf partner for 20 years was gone, replaced by someone I'd never seen before. "Sit," Down and shut up while we figure out how badly you've damaged this institution." As Clark sank back into his chair, I felt Dad's presence in the room as clearly as if he were standing behind me. All those warnings about external influences, all those carefully crafted legal protections, he'd known something like this might happen. He'd prepared for it. But what Clark and Bridget didn't know yet was that this confrontation was only the beginning. The real reckoning was still to come. What happened in the next hour was the systematic dismantling of Clark's carefully constructed facade. One by one, I presented evidence that painted a picture so damning that even he couldn't spin it. The board sat in stunned silence as Marcus Webb detailed surveillance findings. Francis Whitmore explained the legal implications, and Emily described the lies Clark had told her about foundation priorities. "The most egregious discovery," I announced, opening the final folder, "is this." I placed a document on the table that made Clark's face go ashen. A proposal from Morrison Development LLC for a joint venture with the Hartwell Foundation. A proposal that would have essentially transferred $12 million to Clark's brother's company under the guise of community revitalization. Henry examined the document, his disgust evident. This would have bankrupted our legitimate programs. "That was the plan," I said. "Phase out actual charitable work and use Dad's foundation as a money laundering operation for personal enrichment." Clark finally erupted. "You self-righteous hypocrite!" he snarled, his composure completely shattered. "You act like you're some kind of saint, but you're just another rich girl playing with Daddy's money. You have no idea what real business requires, what actual success looks like." The room fell, silent at his outburst. This was the real Clark. The man who'd hidden behind charm and manipulation finally revealed in all his entitled fury. "Real business?" I stood up, my voice deadly calm. "You mean stealing from homeless shelters? Defrauding cancer research? Lying to widows while planning to abandon them for your accomplice?" Bridget spoke for the first time, her voice shaking. "Clark, stop. Just stop talking." But Clark was beyond reason now, years of resentment pouring out. "You want to know the truth? Your father was a naive fool who wasted millions on people who can't be helped. Homeless addicts, terminal patients, lost causes, throwing money at problems that can't be solved instead of building something lasting." Patricia Wells slammed her hand on the table. "Frank Hartwell was one of the most respected philanthropists in this state. How dare you?" Frank Hartwell was dead weight. Clark spat. "Just like his precious daughter who thinks she can run a foundation based on feelings instead of facts." The cruelty of it, attacking Dad's memory in front of people who'd loved and respected him, finally broke something in me. But instead of tears or rage, I felt an ice-cold clarity settle over me. "You're right about one thing, Clark," I said, quietly. "Dad was generous to a fault. He believed in second chances, in rehabilitation, in the fundamental dignity of every human being." I paused, letting my words sink in. "Which is why I'm not going to give you the same mercy you'd show his." "Memory." I turned to Francis Whitmore. "File criminal charges, fraud, embezzlement, breach of fiduciary duty, everything." "Claudia," Henry began, "perhaps we should handle this quietly." "No." My voice cut through the room like a blade. "Dad taught me that sunshine is the best disinfectant. The community deserves to know how their trust was betrayed." Clark's face had gone gray. "You can't prove anything in court. I have lawyers, resources." "You have stolen money and falsified records," I corrected. "And now you have a very public scandal that will follow you for the rest of your miserable life." As if on cue, my phone buzzed with a text. I glanced at it and smiled for the first time all day. "Oh, and Clark? Remember that reporter from the Herald who's been following foundation stories? She's downstairs in the lobby right now." "Something about an anonymous tip regarding financial irregularities." The color drained completely from Clark's face as he realized that his humiliation was about to become very, very public. The emergency board meeting ended with Clark and Bridget's immediate termination and a unanimous vote to pursue full criminal prosecution. But as the last board member filed out of the conference room, I knew the real work was just beginning. Clark's theft had been more extensive than even I had realized, and I needed to understand the full scope of the damage before I could begin rebuilding. That night, alone in the foundation office, I began the methodical process of unraveling 18 months of systematic fraud. What I discovered was breathtaking in its audacity. Clark hadn't just stolen money, he'd created an entire shadow foundation, complete with fake beneficiaries, fabricated programs, and a network of shell companies that all led back to his personal accounts. The Downtown Outreach Initiative was just the tip of the iceberg. I found evidence of a non-existent youth mentorship program that had supposedly received $150,000, a fictional veterans housing project that had consumed $300,000, and a completely fabricated scholarship fund that had been bleeding $50,000 quarterly. Every program sounded legitimate, complete with professional documentation and glowing testimonials from people who didn't exist. The financial records revealed transfers to accounts I'd never authorized, credit cards I'd never seen, and expenses, for everything from luxury vacations to high-end jewelry, all charged to the foundation's operational budget. Clark had been living like a millionaire on money meant for dying children and homeless families. But the most devastating discovery came when I cross-referenced the Foundation's beneficiary database with actual service providers. Nearly 40% of our supposed grant recipients were fictional. Organizations that existed only on paper, with addresses that led to empty office buildings or mail forwarding services. The scale of the deception was staggering. I called Marcus Webb at midnight, my voice hoarse from hours of document review. I need you to expand the investigation. This goes deeper than we thought. How much deeper? He asked. Clark's been stealing from the foundation for at least 2 years, maybe longer. The fraud is systemic, sophisticated, and ongoing. We're looking at potential losses of over $2 million. Marcus whistled low. That's federal territory. Wire fraud, mail fraud, racketeering if we can prove the conspiracy angle. Can you document everything? Build a case that's absolutely bulletproof? With the evidence you've already gathered? Absolutely. But Claudia, you need to understand what you're unleashing. A case this size will attract serious attention. Federal investigators, media coverage, public scrutiny. Are you prepared for that? I thought about Dad. About his unwavering commitment to transparency and accountability, about the legitimate beneficiaries who'd been denied funding because Clark had diverted their grants to his personal accounts, about Emily and the shelter, residents who would have lost their only safe haven if Clark's plan had succeeded. More than prepared, I said. I want him destroyed, Marcus. Professionally, personally, financially, I want Clark Morrison to understand exactly what it feels like to lose everything. The next morning, I made the call that would change everything. Not to the local police, not to the district attorney, but directly to the FBI's white-collar crime division. Clark had made one fatal mistake. He'd used interstate banking systems to move the stolen money, making it a federal case. Special Agent Sarah Chen arrived at the foundation office within hours, accompanied by a team of forensic accountants who began the process of documenting every fraudulent transaction. Watching them work, I felt a grim satisfaction. Clark had underestimated me from the beginning, assuming I was too naive and trusting to fight back effectively. He was about to learn that underestimating a Hartwell was the most expensive mistake he'd ever made. The FBI investigation moved faster than I'd expected. Within a week, agents had frozen Clark's accounts, seized his computers, and begun unraveling the complex web of financial fraud he'd constructed. But Clark himself remained free on bail, and according to Marcus Webb's surveillance, he was planning something desperate. He's been making calls to offshore banks, Marcus reported during our morning briefing. And yesterday he met with a travel agent. I think he's planning to run. Special Agent Chen nodded grimly. Flight risk is always a concern in white-collar cases. We could move to revoke his bail, but we'd need more evidence of imminent flight. I had a better idea. What if we gave him a reason to stay? Something he couldn't resist. That afternoon, I called Clark's cell phone directly. He answered on the fourth ring, his voice wary but trying to maintain his old confidence. Claudia, I was wondering when you'd call. We need to talk, Clark, face to face. I don't think that's advisable. My lawyer says, Your lawyer doesn't know about the overseas accounts, I interrupted, letting the lie hang in the air. The ones in the Cayman Islands that the FBI hasn't found yet. There was a long silence. Then, I don't know what you're talking about. Of course you don't. Just like you don't know about the safety deposit box in Sebastian's name. Or the bearer. Bonds you've been hiding in your mother's house? I was improvising now, but Clark's sharp intake of breath told me I'd hit close to something real. What do you want? He asked finally. To make a deal. Meet me tonight at the foundation office. 9 o'clock. Come alone and we can discuss terms. That might keep you out of federal prison. Why would you help me? I let my voice crack slightly, channeling the broken woman he'd thought he'd married. Because despite everything, I still love you. And maybe there's a way we can work this out together. It was exactly what Clark wanted to hear. That I was still the naive, emotional woman who could be manipulated by appeals to our shared history. His relief was audible through the phone. 9 o'clock, he agreed. But Claudia, if this is some kind of trap, it's not. I lied smoothly. I just want my husband back. After I hung up, Agent Chen looked at me with a mixture of admiration and concern. You're sure you want to do this? If he's desperate enough to run, he might be dangerous. He won't hurt me, I said with confidence I didn't entirely feel. Clark's a coward and a thief, but he's not violent. Besides, you'll be listening to every word. That evening, I arrived at the foundation office early to help the FBI technicians set up recording equipment. They'd wired the conference room with cameras and microphones sensitive enough to pick up a whisper. Agent Chen and her team would be positioned in the building across the street, ready to move in if needed. At exactly 9 o'clock, I heard Clark's key in the front door. He still had access. I'd deliberately not changed the locks, knowing this moment would come. His footsteps echoed in the empty hallway as he made his way to the conference room where our marriage had effectively ended just days earlier. When he appeared in the doorway, I was struck by how much he'd aged. The confident, charming man I'd known was gone, replaced by someone who looked hunted and desperate. "Hello, Clark," I said softly. "Thank you for coming." Clark entered the conference room cautiously, his eyes scanning for threats that weren't visible. He looked haggard, his usually perfect appearance disheveled, his confident posture replaced by the hunched shoulders of a man under siege. "You look terrible," I said, gesturing to the chair where he'd once sat as my equal partner. "Prison will do that to a person's appearance," he replied bitterly, but he sat down across from me. Even the prospect of it. "It doesn't have to come to that," I said, maintaining the facade of the broken, desperate wife. "We could disappear together, start over somewhere new." Clark's eyes sharpened with interest, but also suspicion. "The FBI has frozen everything. Claudia, my accounts, the house, even my mother's retirement fund. How exactly do you propose we finance this romantic escape?" I leaned forward conspiratorially. "The foundation has emergency funds that aren't in the main accounts. Untraceable cash reserves Dad set up for crisis situations. Nearly $500,000 that the government doesn't know exists." It was a complete fabrication, but Clark's greed made him want to believe it. I could see him calculating, weighing the possibility against the risks. "Where?" he asked. "Safety deposit boxes, multiple banks, small amounts in each to avoid detection." I pulled out a piece of paper with fake bank names and box numbers I'd invented. Dad taught me to always have an escape plan. Clark reached for the paper, but I held it back. First, I need to know everything. All of it. The overseas accounts, Sebastian's involvement, Bridget's role. I need to understand what we're really running from. And just like that, Clark began confessing. Not out of remorse or love, but out of naked self-interest and the belief that I was offering him salvation. He detailed the elaborate scheme, the timeline of his deception, the methods he'd used to hide the stolen money. The Cayman accounts have about 800,000, he admitted. Sebastian's company was just a front. We were planning to liquidate everything through foreign real estate investments. Bridget had contacts in Switzerland who could have cleaned the money completely. And the timeline? When did you start planning this? Clark's smile was cold. The day I realized your father was dying. Heart disease runs in his family. I did my research. I knew he wouldn't last 5 years, so I started positioning myself. Bridget and I met at a conference on nonprofit management. She was already running similar scams on smaller foundations. You've done this before? Bridget has. She's got a talent for it. Creating fake documentation, establishing paper organizations, manipulating grieving widows. His voice carried a note of admiration that made my skin crawl. She spotted the potential in your father's foundation immediately. I forced myself to nod appreciatively, as if impressed by their criminal ingenuity. And if we leave tonight, they'll never find us? With the right preparation, no. Non-extradition countries, new identities, offshore funds they can't trace. Clark was warming to the topic now, his old confidence returning. We could live very well, Claudia. Better than we ever did playing by your father's rules. There's just one problem with your plan, I said, my voice suddenly ice cold. Clark's expression shifted to confusion. What problem? I smiled and looked directly at the hidden camera behind his chair. You're already in prison, Clark. You just don't know it yet. The color drained from his face as understanding dawned. What did you? The conference room door burst open and FBI agents flooded in, weapons drawn. Agent Chen stepped forward with handcuffs. Clark Morrison, you're under arrest for additional charges of conspiracy to commit money laundering, wire fraud, and obstruction of justice. As they cuffed him, Clark looked at me with pure hatred. You lying bitch. You played me. I learned. From the best, I replied calmly. You taught me everything I needed to know about deception. The next few weeks unfolded like dominoes falling in perfect sequence. Clark's recorded confession led to the immediate arrest of Sebastian and the seizure of Morrison Development LLC's assets. Bridget, facing federal charges and the prospect of decades in prison, turned state's evidence and provided investigators with details of similar schemes she'd run at 3 other foundations across the country. But it was the media coverage that truly delivered the justice I'd been seeking. The Herald's investigative series, The Hartwell Foundation Fraud, ran for 6 consecutive days, detailing every aspect of Clark's betrayal. Photos of him in handcuffs, sobbing as he was led to a federal detention center, became front-page news. The man who'd spent months calculating how to humiliate me was now experiencing public shame on a scale he'd never imagined. I stood at the window of my restored office, Dad's office, reading the latest headlines on my phone when Emily knocked on the door. The reporters are here for your press conference, she said softly. Are you ready? I straightened Dad's photo on my desk and checked my reflection in the window. I wore the same navy suit I'd worn to that disastrous board meeting, but now it felt like armor rather than a funeral shroud. More than ready. The foundation's main conference room was packed with journalists, cameras, and microphones. I walked to the podium where Clark had once announced his fake merger and looked out at the sea of faces waiting for my statement. 2 months ago, I began, my voice clear and strong. This foundation was nearly destroyed by people who saw charitable giving as an opportunity for personal enrichment. Today, I'm here to announce that not only have we recovered from that betrayal, but we're stronger than ever. I detailed the FBI's recovery of stolen funds, the Foundation's renewed commitment to transparency, and our expanded programs for the coming year, but it was the personal element that made the story resonate. My father taught me that true wealth isn't measured in dollars accumulated, but in lives changed. Clark Morrison thought he could steal that legacy, corrupt that mission, and reduce everything my father built to a vehicle for personal greed. I paused, letting the camera capture my steady gaze. He was wrong. A reporter raised her hand. "Mrs. Morrison, how does it feel to know that your husband is facing up to 30 years in federal prison?" I'd prepared for this question, but the answer came from my heart. Clark Morrison stopped being my husband the moment he decided to steal from homeless children and dying patients. The man in federal custody is a stranger who happened to share my bed and my name. I feel no sympathy for him, only relief that he can't hurt anyone else. Another journalist asked about the personal toll. "How do you move forward after such a profound betrayal of trust?" "By remembering why this work matters," I replied. Every dollar Clark stole was meant to feed a hungry family, house a homeless, veteran, or fund medical research. When I think about the people who needed that help and didn't receive it because of his greed, it makes moving forward not just possible, but necessary. After the press conference, I returned to the shelter that had unknowingly played such a crucial role in my story. Emily was waiting in her office, the same space where I'd first revealed my identity as the anonymous donor. "So," she said with a smile, "I guess this means you're not planning to stay in our dormitory permanently?" I laughed, the first genuine laugh I'd had in months. "No, I think I'll stick to funding the beds rather than sleeping in them." "Any regrets about how you handled things?" I considered the question seriously. "Only one. I regret trusting Clark, with Dad's legacy in the first place. But sometimes we have to lose everything to understand what's truly worth fighting for." 6 months later, I stood once again at the entrance of the Riverside Community Shelter, but this time I wasn't carrying garbage bags and broken dreams. Today marked the opening of the shelter's new transitional housing wing, the very project Clark had blocked when he was sabotaging Emily's proposals. The irony wasn't lost on me. The money Clark had stolen and hidden in offshore accounts had been fully recovered by the FBI and returned to the Foundation. That recovered money, combined with donations that poured in after the media coverage of our story, had allowed us to expand the shelter beyond even Dad's original vision. "Ready for the ribbon cutting?" Emily asked, appearing beside me with a pair of golden scissors. "More than ready," I replied, looking at the gleaming new building that would provide transitional housing for families moving from crisis to stability. Dad would have loved this. The ceremony was smaller than the one we'd held for the original shelter opening, but more meaningful. The attendees were primarily people whose lives had been touched by the Foundation's work, former shelter residents, who'd found permanent housing, scholarship recipients now in college, families fed by our food bank partnerships. As I cut the ribbon, I thought about the journey that had brought me here. The night Clark had abandoned me at this very shelter, he'd thought he was delivering me to my lowest point. Instead, he'd brought me home to the place where I could do the most good. "Mrs. Morrison," called a voice from the small crowd. I turned to see Marcus Webb, the private investigator who'd helped expose Clark's crimes. "Any final thoughts on everything that's happened?" I considered his question carefully. Sometimes we think we're protecting what matters most by holding on tightly, by trusting the wrong people, by avoiding difficult truths. I learned that the only way to truly protect something precious is to fight for it when it's threatened, no matter the personal cost. After the ceremony, I drove to the cemetery where Dad was buried. I'd been coming here regularly since the trial ended, updating him on the Foundation's progress and seeking his guidance for difficult decisions. Clark was sentenced to 25 years, I said, kneeling beside his headstone. Sebastian got 15. Bridget will serve 12 years and pay full restitution to all the foundations she defrauded. I arranged fresh flowers, the same white roses he'd loved. The foundation is stronger than ever, Dad. We're helping more people than you ever dreamed possible. A soft breeze rustled the leaves of the oak tree shading his grave, and I felt his presence as clearly as I had during those dark months when I thought I might lose everything. I kept your warning letter, I continued. The one about external influences. You knew Clark might try something like this, didn't you? I smiled, imagining his modest shrug. You protected the foundation even from the grave. As I drove back to the foundation office, my office now, truly and completely, I reflected on how much had changed. The naive, trusting woman who'd signed away her power to a manipulative husband was gone. In her place was someone harder, but wiser, someone who understood that true strength came not from avoiding betrayal, but from surviving it and emerging stronger. My phone buzzed with a text from Emily. New family just arrived at the shelter. Single mother with 2 kids, lost their apartment when her husband cleaned out their bank account and disappeared. Sound familiar? I smiled and typed back. On my way. Let's show her she's not alone. Because that's what the Hartwell Foundation had always been about. Not just providing money, but providing hope. And after everything I'd been through, I had plenty of both to share. The woman Clark had tried to destroy was gone. The woman who'd taken her place was unstoppable. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.